Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the very nice presentation, and thank you very much for the invitation to present here in APSAD. It had been a while that I had not been in APSAD. Actually, I was remembering yesterday, and the previous time was 7 years ago. I had just arrived to Melbourne. I was still jet lagged, so I didn't remember anybody. So maybe I saw some people there that remember me, but it was good to come back and reconnect with everybody. I'm not an early morning person, so let's see how we go, but that means as well that I'm really appreciative of so many people turning up early in the morning. So thank you very much for that. So I'm going to be talking about this idea of trying to use the knowledge that we have gathered from neuroscience to try to get neuroscience knowledge closer to the clinic. And there is a couple of ideas through the presentation, but it would be great to have your feedback as well later on. So I would start by showing an image of the brain. I promise I think it's going to be the only one that I'm going to show in the whole presentation. This is a paper that we published this year in Nature Primers, and it was a little bit of a summary of knowledge that we have accumulated about what goes wrong in the brain of people with addiction. And you're probably very familiar with a lot of these issues by now. I think the main message in this section of the paper was that addiction is essentially a problem of integration of information between different systems in the brain. And you have some systems that are deep into the brain, like core into the brain, like the striatum, and probably you have heard a lot about that. So the striatum is very important for motivation, and it's very important for reward-related behavior. So some of the biases that people with addiction have around, like drug stimuli, cravings, we think have to do with some habits that are formed in the striatum. And then we have a number of regions in the prefrontal cortex, and you have something like medial orbitofrontal cortex or ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is very important for decision making. And then we have another set of regions that are limbic or paralimbic, like the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the insula. And all those regions are very important to process emotions, and they also, especially the insula, is specialized in tracking everything that is happening in the body. So you can imagine that for someone that have addiction problems and they are in withdrawal or they're experiencing strong cravings, all those feelings are experienced in the body, and then they are read by the brain, and that information is passed to other systems that have to make decisions. So let's say that the communication between all those different systems is what eventually drives a lot of the behavior of people with addiction when they're struggling to maintain abstinence or when they are struggling to find the path to recovery. But I guess the main limitation with this, and this is something that people keep telling me, is that, okay, but I don't work with brains, and I've never seen a brain taking drugs, and I've never seen a brain shopping in the supermarket, right? And that is true. But I'm sure you've seen people thinking, right? And all of you, no matter what you do within the addiction field, you interact with people, and you interact with people that think and make decisions. And that is our main point of interest. So we focus on cognition. And the idea that I wanted to convey in this slide is that cognition is somehow at the interface between the neurobiological characteristics and the expression of the behavior. So it's something that is in the middle way between like what happens in the brain and what happens in your life in terms of the things you do, the choices you make, the relationships you have, the social connections you have. And that makes it much more interesting, right? So now it's not anymore about pretty pictures in the brain or ugly pictures in the brain, depending on how you take it. It's more about how people think and how we can modify how people think to make it more effective and to make it easier for them, or to empower them to resist temptation, to self-regulate, to prevent relapse. And that has been our main interest. So I think like that would be one of the messages. And for a very long time, I've been making the point that cognition is central to addiction. So in the same way that when we try to characterize psychosis, we say that it's characterized by delusion and hallucinations, or when we try to say that Alzheimer's disease is characterized by memory loss, I think that addiction is characterized by cognitive alterations, and those cognitive alterations relate to drug-related biases that are very powerful, relate to executive dysfunction, so problems to inhibit prepotent behaviors, to self-regulate behavior, to align your behavior with long-term goals. And it's also associated with alterations in decision-making. So if we really want to understand addiction, we have to understand how cognitive systems operate and how they are altered by addiction issues. So I think that was part of the thing that I wanted to emphasize with this slide. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize is that people tend to see these relationships only in one direction. So we tend to think, okay, we have neurobiological alterations, then we have cognitive deficits, and then we have a number of substance use disorder symptoms, and we have behavioral presentations and social manifestations, whatever it is. But there is another direction, right? So as soon as people start to make recovery-oriented changes, as soon as people start to undergo treatment, make an effort to change some of those behavioral processes, make efforts to reconnect with their friends, with their partners, with their loved ones, probably they're already making changes in their cognition, they are rebalancing the evaluation of rewards, they are learning to self-regulate a little bit better, they are training new ways of making decisions, and probably that is leading to neurobiological reorganization. So I want you to think about this in both ways. And even though like a little bit of what I'm going to be presenting today is going to be about cognitive deficits, I think we have to think about those deficits as something that can be reorganized, that can be retrained, and can be rehabilitated. I guess a main point of interest for us have been, okay, if we want to put cognition at the center of addiction research, we have to understand what are the cognitive processes that are key to addiction. That generates a lot of debate, and I think a lot of people have tried to approach this question in different ways. Some people have legitimately tried to, for example, say, okay, let's try to see what we know from schizophrenia, or what we know from depression, or what we know from neurological disorders, and let's try to come up with a neuropsychology of addiction that is based on that. And that is a possible approach, but probably we're going to lose some elements in the way, right? So what we wanted to do is to try to understand what are the key cognitive processes that are specific to addiction. And to that, we organized this Delphi consensus exercise. So we did the classic iterative approach with 60 to 70 different experts across the world. And originally we took a number of different cognitive domains, and we took them directly from the research domain criteria, so from the NIH RDoC matrix. And then we sent those domains to these experts, and we asked them to rate them in terms of how relevant they were for addiction. And then we engaged in this iteration in which they came up with new constructs, and in the end, we pruned everything, and we came up with the key constructs according to experts that are key for addiction neuropsychology. And you can see them here, and you can see them also rated in terms of whether they were more relevant for addiction vulnerability or for addiction chronicity, which actually didn't play out in terms of a lot of differences between them. But you can see that the 8 constructs that were kind of acknowledged by all the different experts were reward valuation, reward expectancy, action selection, reward learning, habit, response selection and inhibition, and compulsivity. So the first thing that is kind of shocking is that probably is not the same way that you've been thinking about cognition. It's not the classic visual, spatial, visual motor, learning, memory, attention, executive function. So when we ask experts to identify the ones that were related to addiction, you can see that there is a lot around reward valuation and reward learning. There is a lot around control and habits, and there is something around compulsions and compulsivity. And actually, habit and compulsivity were the only ones that people identified as being related to chronicity and not necessarily to vulnerability. But the interesting thing is that there is a lot of overlap in most of them in terms of seem to be relevant both for addiction vulnerability and for chronicity. And I'll tell you a little bit more about some of them during the presentation today. So I'm going to be talking about reward valuation, reward learning, response selection and inhibition, and compulsivity. And to talk about those processes, most of the information, most of the data that I'm going to be presenting is coming from this cohort or this sample of people, treatment-seeking people with methamphetamine use problems that we have recruited in Melbourne over the last 5 years. So you can see here some of the clinical characteristics of the population. So this is the methamphetamine group. And I put them in blue just to remind myself that a lot of the graphs that I'm going to show afterwards, people with methamphetamine problems are going to be in blue, so bear with me. And then we have the control group, and I use different colors to the control group, so don't pay too much attention to that. But in any case, just in terms of characteristics, we wanted to match the people with methamphetamine problems and controls in terms of sex, in terms of age, education, socioeconomic status, and IQ. You can see here that they had slightly lower IQs, but that was because we measured both verbal and performance IQ. Their verbal IQ was very similar to the control group, but their performance IQ was a little bit lower than the controls. And that is something that is quite consistent in people with substance addiction, because we think performance IQ is quite related to executive function, which is one of the main problems that they do have. These are some of the characteristics in terms of patterns of use. So bear in mind these characteristics, because a lot of the information that I'm going to provide is related to this sample. So we have been using measures that are sensitive to some of the constructs that I've mentioned before. And these are not the real tasks, these are just images, and the reason is because the real tasks are much more boring than these images, so I thought for the presentation I better use these ones. But if you're interested in the actual tasks, you can ask me. So we use the continuous performance test, which is a test of attention and response inhibition, in which you have a series of letters flashing up in the screen, and people have to press a key whenever they see a target, which is most letters, and they have to avoid pressing the key when they see the distractor, which is just one letter that appears out of the blue, like from time to time. And then we have some tasks that are about reward valuation, and you can try to understand reward valuation into different contexts. One of them is in terms of how much effort are you willing to spend to obtain a reward. So for example, last night we were in the early and mid-career researchers kind of workshopping and networking event, and a lot of this was about like, okay, how much effort do we want to spend to be able to secure an NHMRC fellowship? Well, that's a decision you have to make. So it's one of the things that you measure when you try to measure reward valuation. And you can also measure reward valuation in terms of how long are you willing to wait to obtain that reward. So it's the classic delay discounting paradigm, in which I can ask you something like, do you want $5 now, or do you want $50 in 3 months' time? And based on that, we can make an estimate of how much or how long people are willing to wait just to get the greater reward versus getting the immediate reward that is smaller now. So that's for reward valuation. And then we also use paradigms of reward learning. So we've been using a task, and I'll be chatting a little bit more about that task later on. It's the Iowa Gambling Task. It's a task of decision-making in uncertain conditions. So that means that you have a number of possible choices, and you have to sample the different choices. And through the sampling and the trying different choices, you're going to get feedback, and you have to learn which options are good and which options are bad. And good or bad, in this case, is defined as options that are safe, because they give you small rewards, but safe rewards, so you're going to win a lot of money if you keep investing on those ones, versus choices that are very risky, because they give you very high rewards, but they are also exposed to giving you a lot of punishment, a lot of loss. And in that way, if you keep persisting on those choices, you're going to be broke at the end of the game. So it's kind of a game in which you have to use reward learning to navigate between safety and risk. So I'm going to show you the results that we got in the comparison between the cohort of people with methamphetamine problems and controls following the same order that I was showing here. So the first thing that we have is response inhibition and action selection. And if you see, I'm going to be reading the graph from left to right. And remember, methamphetamine is in blue, and the controls in this case are in green. So the first thing that you have is reaction time. And you can see that they're very good in terms of reaction time. So there's no differences. They're as quick as the control group in terms of like responding to the targets and the distractors. But the second thing that you find starts to be interesting because it's reaction time variability, which is the standard deviation of the reaction time across the task. And you can see that the group with methamphetamine problems have much more variability. What that means is that they are constantly zoning in and zoning out of the task. So they can do pretty well. They can be very quick and accurate at certain points of the task, but they can also very quickly zone out of the task and start to underperform compared to themselves. So that was an interesting one to begin with. And then you have two different parameters from signal detection theory. So the discriminability is about like your ability to discriminate between the target and the distractor. So that means that they were getting much more mistakes related to identifying the distractor as a target. On the other hand, they didn't have problems in terms of the response criterion, and that means that they were like having a consistent response bias, so they were not more keen to respond to the distractor versus the target. So we can see a little bit of inhibition problems that seem to be related to attention regulation difficulties. Then this is the task of how much effort are you willing to put to obtain a reward. And you can see that the methamphetamine group systematically are less willing to put effort to obtain a reward. And the interesting thing is that you have the different probabilities. So here you have a low probability of obtaining the reward. Here you have medium, and here you have high. And the interesting thing is that the significant differences emerge for rewards that had a very high probability. So if you translate that into a clinical setting, you say, okay, if you do this program, you're very likely to be much more competent at the end of the program. It is very likely, believe me. The reward is very probable, but they are not as willing to put enough effort to get that reward. Then we got into delay discounting, and this is a set score. So essentially, higher scores means that people are more likely to obtain the immediate reward, to get the immediate thing, rather than waiting for the larger one. And you can see that regardless of the magnitude, no matter if it's small, medium, or large, they always more willing to want the immediate reward and not waiting for the larger delayed reward. And then this is the Iowa Gambling Task, in which essentially what we plot is the tendency to select the risky choices. And so you can see that the control group, higher scores mean more safe choices. So you can see that the control group initially samples a little bit, like test and try the different options, but very quickly, like in the task, they start to have a preference for the safe choices. But on the other hand, the group with methamphetamine problems, they keep a consistent preference for the risky choices throughout the task. And I will show you a little bit more detail about that task a little bit later on. So here you can see how some of the key processes that we had identified in the Delphi consensus, we take a cohort of methamphetamine users in Melbourne, and you can see how these constructs play out very well in terms of discriminating the control group and the methamphetamine group in the different tasks. What we did afterwards, and I won't go into the next slides just not to spoil the surprise, but it's not a very good surprise, is we asked them to come back 2 months after the initial assessment. And remember that these were people that were engaged in treatment. So when we did this assessment, they were engaged in treatment. So we asked them to come back 2 months afterwards, and we took a sample of their hair, and we sent them to the lab to do segmental hair analysis, which is a very cool technique by which you can, in every centimeter of hair, you can detect how much drug people have taken in 1 month. And the longer the hair, the greater the length of the period that you can take. The not so pleasant surprise is that out of the 104, we had 70 people that came back and gave us hair samples. And out of the 70, 62 had relapsed. And I can tell you that we were using a very lenient cutoff in the hair analysis. So we were taking 40 nanograms per milligram. In the guidelines that, for example, the European Union uses for drug testing in the workforce is 20 nanograms per milligram. So we're essentially doubling the cutoff. And even within that cutoff, we had something like I don't know, I haven't put it in percentage, but a very high percentage of the people that initially did the cognitive test had relapsed after a couple of months. So I was genuinely surprised by that. I didn't expect so much, but it would be interesting to hear your thoughts afterwards. The good news, though, is that in the people that remained abstinent or were using in levels that were within those 40 nanograms per milligram, there were substantial cognitive improvement. So in the abstainers, specifically in attention, discriminability, and in terms of decision making, you can see how they significantly improve. In this case, like lower scores are better performance. In this case, higher scores are better performance. So I guess the good message is that for those that are able to reduce drug use or to abstain, there is it pays off in terms of cognitive improvement and probably normalization of some of the behavioral manifestations of that cognitive impairment. In other samples, we have shown, this is a study that we did between Netherlands and Belgium, we have shown that reward valuation and reward learning are very strong predictors of clinical outcomes. So in both cases, the people that have greater sensitivity for immediate reward or for risky options, they are much more likely to relapse. And we have seen that specifically in the case of delay discounting, that relationship is kind of mediated by treatment retention. So what happens is that if you're more impulsive in terms of trying to get the immediate reward, you're less likely to stay in treatment. And because you're less likely to stay in treatment, you're at higher risk of relapsing down the line. So we know that these cognitive constructs are directly related to the type of work that you do on a day-to-day basis. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Ioa Gambling Task, and this is quite an old task, but we still do data mining on it, and the amount of information that you can get from it is amazing. So what we've been doing, I'll tell you a little bit more about the task. So essentially people are exposed to these 4 different choices, and they have 100 choices during the task. So what people do, as I was saying before, is they sample a little bit at the very beginning. So they take a little bit of A, a little bit of B, C, D, and they see how it goes. And then based on that, they establish their preference. And from that point on, they kind of consistently choose from one of the decks. The main characteristic is that C and D are very safe in terms of giving you very low reward, but also very low losses. So they are advantageous in the long term. So you win a lot of money choosing from those decks. And A and B are pretty bad because they give you very large rewards, but they also give you massive punishments, and people get broke and get pissed off, and it's really funny. Anyway, so essentially, people sample a little bit and then develop a little bit of a pattern. So we've been doing a little bit of computational modeling to try to understand a little bit better why people with methamphetamine problems do poorly in the task. And so the first thing is a very simple computation, which is how likely are you to stay on the same choice after winning some money, and how likely are you to move to another choice after you have lost some money. And I don't know what would be your hypothesis or your take into this, but people tend to see people with addiction problems as reward maximizers. So they think that every time they see a reward, they keep on that reward. And at the same time, they tend to see them, and this is something that the experts told us as well, as being compulsive. So no matter if they get a lot of losses, a lot of punishment, they perseverate, they keep on doing the same thing. Well, the data seems to suggest something completely different. So what we observed is that if you see the comparison here, and again, methamphetamine is in blue, people with methamphetamine problems is less likely to stay on a choice even after that choice is rewarded. So they make a choice, they get a reward, but they still change. They go for a different thing. Another interesting thing is that after losing money, they're more likely to switch. So you can see that compared to the controls, again, the methamphetamine users, after getting some loss, they are more likely to switch their behavior. So the experts were wrong. They don't seem to be compulsive. They seem to be a little bit more erratic in the way they make decisions and in the way they manage reward and punishment. Why that is the case? So we've been fitting different mathematical models, and one of the ones that we have fitted is this model that is sensitive to exploration versus exploitation. And as I was saying before, like let's say the advantages pattern in the task is that at the beginning you explore a little bit, and then once you have explored and you have a little bit of a sense of what decks are good, what decks are bad, then you establish a pattern and you're consistent with that pattern. The opposite of that is that you explore a lot, keep exploring, but never get information that is useful to align your behavior with that information. So when we fitted that type of model, you can see again methamphetamine users in blue, they keep a high degree of exploration throughout the task. So it is never that they make this switch between exploration and exploitation, which is what the controls are doing. So it's getting the information, and once you get the information, go with it. So you can see how in this case, excessive exploration is detrimental. It leads to disadvantageous behavior in the long term. The other thing that was very interesting of applying the mathematical models, we got this other parameter that is about predictability. And essentially this is the degree of confidence that you can have, that you can predict the next move that they're going to do based on their previous moves. So based on their history of choices, how confident can you be that you can predict the next choice that they're going to make? And here you can see that you cannot be confident at all. So when I saw this data, it reminded me a lot of conversations that I had had with clinicians telling me, I thought this guy was going to be a hit. I thought this guy was going to be graduated from the program. He was going to be amazing. He was going to reconnect with the family. It's going to be a fabulous recovery story. Next week, the guy is back in the treatment center. It is really, really hard to predict what is the next behavior based on the history of behavior, which is really, really shocking in some regards. So for those of you that are saying, okay, Antonio, you do your fancy modeling in your cognitive tasks, but how is this relevant to us? Well, that is the main, the main agenda that we've been having for a while now. We want to find ways in which we can translate all this information to clinical settings so that this information can be useful on a patient-by-patient basis to inform your decision-making. So I guess there are a number of things that are challenging for us. So we want to develop cognitive testing that is able to discriminate the problems of people with drug use, and also individual differences within the population of people with drug use, because there is a lot of heterogeneity. We want to have tools that are ecologically valid. So, for example, we want tools that are able to predict in real life what is the people that is going to be in trouble and what is the people that are going to do fine. And we want to be flexible. We want to learn. So we want to apply some models, but we want to test them. And if they are not very good in predicting outcomes, if they're not very useful for you, then now we have interesting applications to try to allow the model to learn itself and change itself in a way that can be dynamically adjusted to be each time a little bit better. From your point of view, from the point of view of a lot of people working in clinical settings, it's about acceptability. So is this something that you can do on a day-to-day basis? And is this something that the patients are going to deal with, are going to be happy to engage with? I guess the main thing is, can we convince you that through these you can get an accurate prediction of outcomes, so you can achieve that predictability that you cannot achieve sometimes based on clinical judgment, even though clinical judgment for most of you is fantastic, and I know it because I work a lot with addiction clinicians. And I guess most importantly, can this knowledge help you to develop novel treatment interventions? Can it help you to develop new approaches that can be better than the ones that we have in terms of addressing some of the challenges, in terms of rather than getting 61 out of 70 relapsing after a couple of months, having maybe 30 or having maybe 20. So that's the challenge that we have. So we've been working in some applications to try to bridge that gap. This is a suite of cognitive measures that we have developed. It is called the Cognitive Impulsivity Suite. And it is something that you do online, so you can do it from home, you can do it in your tablet, you can do it in your mobile. And the interesting thing is that we did it in a way that is sensitive to the key mechanisms that we were discussing before. So things like action selection, response inhibition, reward valuation, reward learning. And at the same time, like the reason why you see has kind of a Wild West type of theme is because we designed it in a way that people could do it from home. And I'll tell you in a minute why was that. But the challenge is that if you are asking people to do this from home, like what is the motivation, right? Like when they come to an experiment or when they come to the clinic, they have a motivation. They have a clinical motivation, or they want to participate in research. They want to get a Myers voucher, whatever it is. But if they're doing it from home, you need something that somehow sparks their curiosity. And that is why we kind of engaged some video gaming designers, and we did it in this way that could be a little bit more engaging for people. The other thing is we have designed it in a way that you can automatically apply some of the computational modeling that I was presenting before. So after doing the battery, after doing the suite of tests, you can have immediate feedback about how people are performing in the test in a very detailed way. And I guess the other thing is that for us, it's a great opportunity to get what we call big data and being able to apply machine learning models to see if we can teach these tools to predict better clinical outcomes. So I'm going to show you how one of them works. And let me see if I can, yeah, that's the mouse. So that is one of them. It's what we call a reversal learning task. Hopefully it works. So you have two miners there, and one of the miners seems to be lucky most of the time, so it's giving you a lot of gold. And the other miner is a little bit of a loser, so you just have to try to go for the lucky miner and win a lot of gold. But at some point during the task, the lucky miner is going to change. And that is the way in which we challenge reward learning. So we try to see whether people is able to detect the change in the contingencies and is able to adapt their behavior to the changing contingencies. So you can see how it's animated. So you can see how people can do it like a little bit like a game. So what we did is, and we did this project in collaboration with Turning Point, we hosted it in the website, in the online counseling website of Turning Point. So the advantage of that is that everybody that is seeking treatment through online counseling and is happy to do a little bit of self-assessment of impulsivity and decision-making, they can do the task, the information come to us, the information can be immediately feedback to the clinicians, and they can have like very detailed performance indices to try to use it in the clinical practice. So this is a type of information that you can get based on analysis of this task. Again, what we saw is that people with methamphetamine problems are not compulsive. What they have is a little bit of a problem to learn reward and punishment related contingencies throughout the task. So you can see them here in gray. So you can see like from the very beginning, each phase is a change in contingencies. And you can see that they had a problem to learn the task in the beginning, and then that learning problem stays throughout the task. But when you analyze their switching behavior, you can see that they're actually more likely to switch. So this is the probability of switching after negative feedback. So again, replicating what we had seen before, you can see that they're more likely to switch behavior after negative feedback. All right, so I guess like hopefully that was persuading. I guess like the last part of the talk is going to be about how we can use this information to develop new interventions. And this is a figure that I took from a recent consensus that we have published. This is the Neuroscience interest group of the International Society of Addiction Medicine. They will be meeting tomorrow and the day afterwards in New Delhi. You're still on time to go if you're interested. And I guess the consensus that we reached is that we want to move into having a paradigm of discovery in closed loops in which we can maximize the different approaches that we have, both cognitive testing and neuroimaging at the assessment level, and cognitive training and remediation interventions and neuromodulation at the intervention level to try to maximize the possibilities that we have of targeting key mechanisms, designing pragmatic assessments and interventions, and being able to improve the way we deliver, the way we approach interventions in addiction and the way we deliver intervention in addiction to try to improve clinical outcomes. So before, I was saying that people with methamphetamine use problems have issues zoning out when they have to do demanding attentional tasks. They have problems with reward valuation and reward learning. So they have problems to stop the prepotent behavior that comes like related to obtaining the immediate reward. They have problems to align their behavior with long-term goals, and they have problems to make decisions. And then you I hope I would have an intervention that could address all of those things. Well, the good news is we have it. And it's this intervention that is called goal management training that was originally developed to deal with executive dysfunction in people with different manifestations of brain injury. But the key thing is that I guess when you have an intervention that was originally developed for a population with brain injury and you're trying to apply it with people with addiction, as I was saying before, you're at the risk of getting lost in translation. So what we had to do is stepping back, and we've been doing a lot of work in trying to repackage goal management training into becoming an intervention that is useful for the end users that is directed to. So we've done a lot of ethnographic research. We've done a lot of collaboration with a group at Monash that is called Health Collab, and they're experts in design based on end user necessities. And we have come up with a repackaged version of goal management training, which is a group intervention that you administer across 4 weeks. And each of the modules is focused on one of the cognitive deficits that I was mentioning before. So the first one is about being aware of the chances of getting zoned out and the need to zone in again to reconnect with the current behavior and with the current goal. Some strategies to link mindfulness exercises with stop abilities, with response inhibition abilities. Some strategies to envision and maintain goals in your working memory. We're using new techniques that are called episodic future thinking, which are kind of an enhanced form of prospection to try to help people envision the future and align their behavior with future goals, and using different techniques to improve decision making. And the idea is that at the end of the program, at the end of the training, they have to own this GMT cycle. So they have to own this strategy, and they have to apply this strategy to every situation, to every challenging situation that they find that they face in real life. So now we're trying to come up with different ways in which we can provide something tangible to them, and we don't know exactly what it's going to be. Some people is thinking just on a bracelet, something that they can wear all the time that has the whole GMT cycle, so that they are reminded constantly that they can use this cycle to face different situations in daily life. Another approach that is directly informed by neuroscience evidence is cognitive bias modification that has been led by Vic Manning at Turning Point with a lot of contributors that I can see here in the audience as well. And this is based on the idea that addiction is related to a lot of motivational bias that direct your behavior immediately towards alcohol-related stimuli or drug-related stimuli. And the idea is that through some simple training that is usually done with a joystick, you can actually retrain those biases, and you can teach people to avoid alcohol-related stimuli, and you do that through a joystick exercise in which you push the joystick away, and then the image becomes tinier and tinier and tinier, and eventually disappear. And then you train people to approach alternative stimuli, which is, in the case of alcohol, is very easy because it can be just non-alcoholic drinks. In the case of other drugs, it can be a little bit more challenging. So we are playing a little bit as well with approach bias modification, and what we're doing at the moment is testing different modes of delivery. So testing different ways in which you can apply approach bias modification. So it can be the classic joystick version, or we have developed an app version that you can do on your mobile phone. And the approach avoidance is just with a movement of the wrist. So you can avoid certain things just like moving the wrist like that, and you can approach things just moving the wrist like that. And we are testing as well virtual reality applications of the same thing. So putting the thing into virtual reality and helping people to approach and avoid the stimuli in a virtual reality environment. And I guess the idea is finding the ideal format for the ideal population. So getting users involved in the design process from the very beginning and trying to understand which type of delivery seems to be more appropriate for them. There's kind of the idea of co-designing and trying to use technology when it's needed, but maybe sometimes it's not needed. And sometimes a booklet or a pamphlet is the best mode of delivery if that is the best way of conveying the information to end users. So we're trying to promote much more research into understanding these and into try to design what is the best intervention for different types of people. And then I put here these about implementation and business models. And I guarantee you that at least up to this point, business models is not about me making a lot of money. Like maybe now I'm starting to get interested in getting a lot of money, but up to this point I was not interested at all. But I realized at some point that a lot of the things that we do in the lab, we don't find ways of putting them out there to the world. So you can have like a super interesting task that you have developed and it's fantastic and you want other people to use it. And then you start to share it and then people start coming back to you with issues and troubleshooting and so on, and you cannot be technical support 24/7 for everybody around the world, right? So you need people to help you to package that into something that can be, I don't know, hosted somewhere, or you can pay a small fee and access it, whatever it is. You need people to help you to develop those business models which are essentially there to help you reach out and help you like make the tools that you develop accessible for everybody. So we're trying to do a lot of research on that as well. So the last thing that I wanted to tell, I promised I wouldn't show you another picture of the brain, but I'll show you just one more. And it is just to tell you that a different avenue that we're trying to progress is using neuroimaging, advanced neuroimaging, to inform non-invasive brain stimulation. I think the main advance in the field of neuroimaging has been a transition between what people call blobology, so essentially like putting people into the scan and getting a bunch of regions lighting up that you don't know exactly what it means, into a much more integrative approach in which you can try to understand a whole system. Like, for example, what I'm depicting here is the decision-making system, and you can see that you have very different regions in the brain that contribute to decision-making. And now we have techniques to try to understand how those different regions communicate with each other. So we can know if, for example, addiction is associated with increased excitation from the VMPFC into the striatum and decreased inhibition from the insula to the striatum. I'm just making this up, don't take notes or anything. What I mean is that rather than like analyzing the brain as discrete portions of the brain, what we can do is trying to understand how different regions are communicating with each other. If we understand that, and if we understand how that communication goes wrong in addiction, the direct implication of that is that you can do neuroimaging-informed non-invasive brain stimulation. And I think the main advance in the field of non-invasive brain stimulation is that, as you know, in addiction, obviously the prefrontal cortex and cortical systems are really important, but there is also a lot of addiction pathophysiology that is quite deep into the brain. And up to this point, we were not able to reach those deeper parts of the brain. Or sometimes, like, we could reach some of those parts of the brain, but we didn't know how, let's say, stimulation in the prefrontal cortex interacted with activity or with communication in those deeper parts of the brain. Now we have a better understanding of that, and now we have non-invasive techniques that are able to stimulate much deeper in the brain. So using different coils, for example, now we can stimulate or inhibit in the prelimbic anterior cingulate or in the insula. So we're reaching deeper areas of the brain that can be key to addiction. And we can also use even conventional TMS to stimulate circuits. Like, for example, like now we are testing ventromedial prefrontal cortex stimulation, which essentially is putting the coil here. And we're doing that because we know that by inhibiting activity in the VMPFC, you normalize activity in the striatum and the insula. And that is massive, because then you're normalizing a whole circuit. It's not that you're just stimulating a region, it's that you're reorganizing a whole system. So there's a lot more to do in this space as well. And I know it sounds like a little bit like, oh my God, I'm not gonna fry the brain of my patients. It's not like that, but of course, like there's a lot to do in terms of safety, tolerability, and developing the best protocols before we move into clinical trials with clinical populations. So in conclusion, reward valuation, reward learning, and inhibitory control deficits are key to addiction pathophysiology, and they are clearly related to clinical outcomes. So this is something that we find in the lab, and this is something that we also find in the clinic, and the two things are interrelated. Individual differences, and that means individual differences between people who have drug problems and people that are seemingly healthy, and also individual differences within cohorts of people with substance use problems are massive, and we need to understand those individual differences. It is not like, we cannot say like every person with drug problems that are going to show up in the clinic, they're going to have decision-making problems. That is not true. So we have to try to understand that. And for that, there is a need, and we're trying to feed that need for brief, automatized cognitive tools that can be effectively used in clinical settings so that you can use it on a day-to-day basis, on a patient-by-patient basis. Neuroscience-informed interventions that are targeted to the key mechanisms and personalized to users, both in terms of the mechanisms that we're targeting and also the mode of delivery that is more useful to the people that we have in front of us. I honestly believe that they have the potential to create a new generation of treatment interventions for people with substance addiction. And finally, I think like there are huge opportunities to use new technology. I've given you some examples here. New technology can be something like virtual reality when it's used properly, not because we can, but because there is some way of using virtual reality to enhance some of the active ingredients of an intervention that we think it works. And also technology like imaging technology and non-invasive brain stimulation technology. There are huge opportunities to use these type of technologies to enhance engagement and active ingredients of the interventions that we know help. And these are acknowledgements to the different funding bodies that help us to conduct this research. And to everybody in the group, I realized that this is you don't know, but some people here would know. This is an old picture, but I didn't find a most updated one. But the good thing is that it has some of the key people that contributed to this study.